wanted to take a second to make a fairly quick video trying to keep up to date with my New Year's somewhat resolution to make more content at a higher frequency and have it not be quite so long. So I wanted to take a brief pause out of the day today to bring up something that has rubbed me a little bit the wrong way over the past couple of weeks. I've seen a few examples of people, I would say, dramatically misinterpreting the perspective of Jordan Peterson's philosophy and approach to problem solving in ways that I believe say more about their lack of understanding in terms of Peterson's specific and rather nuanced and also unusual approaches to understanding both the problems of today's world and also people's behaviors or philosophical stances within the world. And they are quite unique perspectives, and it's quite understandable, I think, that people don't immediately understand where he's coming from or resonate necessarily with his specific perspective. For example, the debates between him and Sam Harris come to mind initially as an example of this dichotomy. But recently, I've seen this exhibited in a few specific ways. So first, the thing that I would like to talk about is we're going to talk about two types of situations here that I've seen recently. One is the situation in which people critique Peterson's understanding of postmodernism. And I'm going to make the claim that rather than Peterson not understanding postmodernism, that those who are making these specific cases against him are either intentionally or unknowingly misrepresenting Peterson's perspective, or aren't aware of Peterson's actual perspective and approach to philosophical truth and understanding, and therefore do not have the tools or understanding of Peterson required to draw actual conclusions about his knowledge of other domains of philosophy. After all, if he is coming from a place that you don't necessarily understand and making statements about specific categories or interpretations of a set of philosophers, and you don't know where he's coming from, it's very likely that you're going to see him as not knowing what he's talking about. So it's hard to differentiate between those two situations, and hopefully I can clarify some of that. Secondarily, I would like to apply or perhaps shine or help shine a little bit more light on issues that I've seen recently where Peterson has been categorized as either anti-pro-choice or basically anti-abortion, or just like dramatically or egregiously pro-life, or a climate science denier. These things that are just very extreme generalizations that actually have very little to do with the types of things that Peterson has said publicly, even though people will often cite, of course, the unceasing litany of articles who don't take the time, once again, to understand where Peterson is coming from, or the way his thought interacts with the world, or the way his modes of problem solving or interpreting reality unfold when it comes to a complex problem. And so I would like to first begin by, I think, introducing the two things that I think are absolutely critical to understand about Peterson's thought if one is to have any chance of properly interpreting statements he makes about either philosophical categories and their behavioral implications, or about any complex phenomenon in the world with respect to how society should think about solving that problem. So the first thing that we have to understand is that Jordan Peterson has said many times that he resonates deeply with the philosophical school of American pragmatism. And what that essentially means is that as opposed to analytic philosophy, not in entire opposition, but often opposed to analytic philosophy, instead of understanding the world as these formal structures of categories and there being a reality to that specific structure of concepts that is a part or outside of action or embodied behavior, as someone like Plato would have put it all the way back at the very beginning of our recorded history of philosophy. We were still having this debate. There are these ideals, these ideal categories outside of the embodied or behavioral reality, and we can access them, or we can access some perhaps low resolution form of them, but they really exist, and those categories have a structure to themselves outside of our experiential contact with them. Pragmatism is kind of a different way of interpreting the world. Pragmatism is a way of interpreting the world in which you can't actually separate yourself in the way that one might wish to separate themselves from the process of creating these structures, these categories of understanding. Rather than truth being out there to be discovered, truth is a process of understanding the world through the creation of concepts as tools, and these tools and these tool sets, these matrices of pragmatic utility, their capacity to accomplish tasks in the world, their capacity to actually work as a system of as a system that accelerates the adaptive capacity, so to speak, of a given species, or that increases the efficacy of a particular individual in the world, that this is truth, that actually it's really about the symmetry between whatever conceptual structure you hold and its capacity to allow you to enact or hold a particular idea of the world that allows you to manipulate your environment in service of your goals, both short-term and long-term. And to the extent that you can do that with greater efficacy, there's something about that that implies a particular truth with respect to the conceptual structure that you hold in your mind. And so Peterson is very much on this side of the spectrum. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that, and I'm not going to speak for him, although he has said this multiple times, that if he were to associate himself with a historical school of philosophy, he has a deep sympathy for the American school of pragmatism. So this is something that we really need to internalize when we're thinking about what it means for him to make a characterization, for example, about a particular group of philosophers. And we'll get to that in a second, specifically. But before we do so, I would like to talk about the second thing that you have to understand about Jordan Peterson before you begin to draw conclusions about the way he approaches problems in the world. And that second thing that you need to know would be that he has a deep background, not just in clinical psychology, but in a very specific way, a very specific mode of applying clinical psychology. And of course, we're very familiar with the fact that he is interested, intrigued by the perhaps even more mystical aspects of the psychoanalytic tradition, namely Jung, but also Freud. And that is quite interesting, and there's a lot to be said of that. But actually, I don't think that that's as important, per se, to understand about his approach to the world as understanding the deep connection that he seems to have with cognitive behavioral therapy, or the cognitive behavioral approach to treating patients. So what does cognitive behavioral approach mean? One can see this reflected in certain stories that he tells, for example, talking about helping somebody with their fear of going into an elevator. So instead of someone coming to him with the problem of going into an elevator, and him thinking of this problem as a problem of entering or exiting elevators, as just that relatively low resolution idea of the problem at that level of abstraction, his immediate impulse, or the cognitive behavioral strategy, is to try to take that abstraction and break it down into a series of much smaller and more addressable problems that are decomposable, right? So you take the large problem, you decompose the large problem that might seem unaddressable into a series of much more addressable problems that one can think about in a way that doesn't necessarily trigger the negative reactions. So instead of just get on the elevator, you say, can you look at it in an elevator? Could you look at it for 1 second? If you can look at it for 1 second, you have to go on it, you have to do that. And these, I'm not going to rehash this. You can find him talking about this on YouTube. There's multiple videos of this. But you have to understand that this is the cognitive behavioral mode of understanding, digesting, decomposing problems so that you can address them at these much higher resolution levels, because in Peterson's mind, and also from a pragmatic perspective, one has to have a very high resolution and high fidelity conceptual understanding of the world that can be enacted to positive effect, to the desired effect. And if one can actually do that, then what one thinks about the world is, in a sense, true. So these are the two things that we really need to hold in our mind whenever we think about something that Peterson says, whenever we try to analyze, in good faith at least, anything that he says about the world. So let's take these two things and first apply it to the domain of his categorization of postmodernism, and then we will also apply it to the climate and the abortion issues. So first, with respect to postmodernism, I've seen many videos on YouTube that effectively cherry pick various aspects of specific postmodern philosophers, and they will debate whether or not A, these philosophers belong in the category of postmodern or not, which is A, you're already in analytic territory. You're trying to place people in sets, in formal categories or not, and therefore invalidate his arguments based on a set of abstractions or abstract categories that have nothing to do with behavior, really. So I can claim that I am an alien from Mars, but absent a particular set of behaviors that are congruent with that, a particular history of behaviors, a particular continuity of behaviors, it doesn't necessarily mean much. So to the extent that a given philosopher either self-identifies or does not self-identify, or is put into a category or is not put into a category either by themselves or others, from Peterson's perspective, of the pragmatic perspective, this is completely irrelevant. None of this matters. What actually matters is if you look at the ideas, if you look at the concepts of a given set of individuals, you can kind of look at them. Ironically, we'll take a page out of Gilles Deleuze's book, and we'll call it an assemblage. We'll say there are multiple people, multiple philosophers of a time and space who are loosely connected, who form a sort of thought assemblage, a conceptual assemblage. We'll go even further with Deleuze's work, and we'll say that the purpose of a philosopher, what philosophers do, are create concepts. They're the artists of concepts. Okay, so this assemblage of philosophers in time and space is creating a conceptual matrix, conceptual net, right? From someone like Peterson's perspective, the degree to which he's trying to assess the behavior, the side effects, the consequences of this specific time and place in history has very little to do with the specific labels that one either places or does not place on this particular assemblage of individuals. From Peterson's perspective, he would look at it from a behavioral perspective and try to understand, to the extent that people adopt these ideas, to the extent these ideas as a whole, as a semantic web of meaning or a map of meaning, to the extent that people adopt this emergent map of meaning, how does it impact their relationship to the world? How does it impact their relationship to other people or to systems in which they're embedded, social systems, political systems? How does that work out? When you actually try to take those ideas and put them into practice, what happens? And if a specific set of ideas or philosophers give rise to a specific set of ideas, and all of those ideas seem to converge on a particular type of behavior or set of behaviors, it really doesn't matter from Peterson's pragmatic perspective what labels you apply to these philosophers. What matters is the type of behavior those who espouse those ideas, those convergent attractors in the conceptual space outlined by this assemblage of philosophers, what that conceptual structure does to the mind or the social system in which it takes root, right? So to the extent, for example, in the postmodern or in Peterson's perspective, I would say that if I were to try to put on his hat and see the world through his eyes, it is probably most likely that he sees a group of people who swung to the opposite extreme, and almost all of the philosophies of people like, you could talk about Deleuze, or you could talk about Michel Foucault, or you could talk about Derrida, you could talk about many of these philosophers, and a large amount of other philosophers, Baudrillard, or many other people. And while they have very different and broad interpretations, and many of them are incongruent, I think one would be very hard pressed to say that any of them, for example, were really large fans of the idea of an objective hierarchical structure in reality. And so that reaction to the idea of objectivity or moving towards a place of subjective primacy could be a thread that, or a through line that goes throughout that entire school of philosophy. And that is actually something that you could latch onto, and you could ask a question. You could ask the question, well, if you are, as an individual or a society, to take on board the idea that the perspective of the subjective perspective of the individual or any given individual is the primary organizing principle of a society, what would happen to that society? What transformations might you see? What behaviors are possible or no longer possible? And I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader to perhaps think about how that might have something to do with the way that particular cultural trends are unfolding today. So that's the philosophical side of things that you have to understand about Peterson's pragmatism lens. Now let's move over to the side of some of these large abstract problems in today's world, and characterizing Peterson in very political terms as, for example, a climate change denier, or somebody who is just flat out anti-abortion or anti-women's right to choose. So this not only relates a little bit to the pragmatism, but it deeply relates to the aspect of Peterson that is very much influenced by the cognitive behavioral therapy line of thought, or his steeping. He's a creature of that. He's done that for, I don't even know, multiple decades, right? And so this is very much a way of thinking, a way of addressing the world in his mind. And in that world, if you combine the pragmatic lens with the cognitive behavioral tradition, what you get is exactly the way that he talks about the world. For example, if you look at the way that he talks about climate change, he talks about the fact that trying to address climate change at the level of abstraction of climate change is likely not possible or counterproductive. And in many ways, I think that it's actually a deep insight. For example, if you look at the game theory around that, by the time you actually get to the level of dealing with climate change at the interstate or at the international level, you have a very large number of collective action problems that get in the way of successfully addressing these types of macro or high-level abstract issues. And that's because you're very far away from the rubber meeting the road of reality. You're very separated from the actual problem space, the actual behavioral space. Because from Peterson's pragmatic perspective, we're dealing with an emergent reality, and truth is determined based on how we can change with our conceptual understanding bottom up our relationship to that reality across time, as opposed to imposing analytical understanding and thinking that that can solve the problem. So the idea of analyzing top-down climate change and then telling people that it needs to be solved top-down by entities like states is a lot like telling somebody that can't get in the elevator to just get in the elevator. Why can't you get in the elevator? Why don't you understand that elevators aren't going to hurt you? You're not breaking the problem down, right? And to say that because Peterson asks people to think about these problems in higher resolution, asks people to break these problems down into a more componentized version of the problem and think more clearly about how the different layers of resolution interact within themselves, but also with the other layers of resolution, and what is possible at each given layer of resolution or not, what constraints apply to the game at each of these layers of resolution. By asking the world to do that, you're going to call him a climate denier. I would assert or suppose that that might say more about your lack of understanding of his approach than it does about his climate denial. I think the same thing applies to the abortion issue. Without going into it deeply, he is certainly a quote of his that would give credence to this interpretation is that he said, I think something to the effect that by the time you've gotten to the question of abortion, it's generally too late, which is another indication or implication of the fact that you need to understand the problem as an emergent problem that can be deconstructed or broken into many components that are far more addressable at a smaller level, at which we can get a better grip on these problems in ways that aren't as subject to the type of political polarization that corrupts every attempt to solve these problems at these higher levels of state, national, or international abstraction. And so these are two things that I think people don't really understand that well about Peterson's approach to the world. I think that they're the two primary aspects of Peterson's philosophy and worldview and way of being in the world, that if people were to understand and do a little bit more research and perhaps have a little bit more good faith, we could perhaps come to more of an agreement about the ways in which he is advising behavior in this world, and the way in which he is analyzing particular groups of people who espouse ideas that have real world implications. And I think if we could do that, and we could do that in good faith, then we might have a slightly better chance at making it out of this, not just alive, but constantly embittered by our experiences with one another. So that's the video for today. Hope you enjoyed it. A little bit shorter. Let me know what you think in the feedback. If you want more of these, that would be great. Just let me know. I'll make more. If not, I'll do longer content. Have a lot going on, fairly busy, but nice to talk to you. Have a good night.